So it's chapter 6, Mishnah 5, and what we're going to learn today, initially, at least some of the things that we're going to learn, you'll say, this is not a surprise. What does it tell us? It tells us, Al tevakesh gedula la'atzmecha. Do not seek greatness for yourself. Is that a surprise? Do not seek greatness for yourself. Do not seek greatness for yourself. So you would think that that should be common sense. You wouldn't necessarily have to be told this. That's number one. Then it says, Ve'al tachmoid kavod, and do not covet kavod, honor. So that means that you shouldn't desire honor. By the way, I just want to point out that it is a very common error for people to read that line into the next line. People read it, Va'al tachmoid kavod yoser milumudecha. Don't desire more honor than what you have learned. But that's not what it says. There's a comment there for a reason. Al tachmoid kavod, that you shouldn't desire respect or honor. And then it says, yoser milimudecha asay. You should do more than you're learning. Now that's an interesting one to discuss and unpack. What does that mean? You should do more than you're learning. Also, we're going to have to just recheck that word and ensure that we have pronounced it correctly. That word limudecha. Okay? You're going to have to check that as well. So what have we got so far? That you should not seek, right? You should not seek greatness for yourself. You shouldn't desire honor. You should do more than you study, which obviously we're going to have to understand. And these are all very interesting things. And then what seems to be very unrelated. Va'al tisave l'shulchanom shel melachim. You should not desire the tables of kings. What does that mean? You should not desire the tables of kings. And then he goes on to tell us, Sheshulchancha gadol mishulchanam, because your table is greater than their table. Vekisrecha gadol mikisram, and your crown is greater than their crown, which is interesting because you didn't say anything about a crown initially. Initially you just said, don't desire their table. How does the crown come into this conversation? And then to round it all off, he says, that the boss, the master that we answer to is completely reliable, just in case, God forbid, you thought otherwise. It's completely reliable. And he will pay you the reward for what you have done. Okay, so we have to unpack this, because the first parts of the first three suggestions actually seem to be related, or partially related. Certainly the first two are related, but the last one about the tables of the kings seems a very different topic to what we're discussing. So let's first look at this from a very simplistic perspective. Al tevakesh gedula. Don't go looking for your own greatness. Where are you going to find greatness if you were looking for it? Let's assume that we ignored this instruction and we went looking for greatness. Where do you look for greatness? Tevakesh means there's a bit of a play on words over here. You could use the word bakasha, right? It's almost like requesting. Where does a person go to look for greatness, to request greatness, to seek greatness? Where? To learn. So let's remind ourselves that we are in chapter 6 of Pirkei Avos, which also has a nickname, Kinyan Torah. That this is the chapter that's all about how to go about acquiring the Torah. Therefore, if we're talking about a person seeking greatness, the likelihood is it's in the context of Torah learning. So, al tevakesh gedula la'atzmecha. Don't go seeking greatness for yourself. In what context? In Torah learning. The fact that a person shouldn't be looking to blow their own trumpet is common sense. But here we're talking in Torah learning, that a person should not pursue Torah learning with the perspective or with the intention to find greatness for themselves.
For Torah's sake.
Is that a surprise?
No.
Is it a surprise to us that a person should not learn Torah with a purpose of trying to, I don't know, self-aggrandizement? I'm going to become a big deal. Surely that can't be what it means. Surely we already know, and we've learned a number of things through the course of Pirkei Avos about the importance, A, of humility generally, and B, specifically, humility in the context of Torah. So how would a person even consider, at this point, we're assuming that everybody's learned everything until this point, so how could they ever justify that they're going to be looking for greatness in their Torah learning? Clearly, the greatness that we're describing over here is not a sense of being held in high esteem by the community, not that kind of greatness. Clearly, the person is looking for greatness in their Torah learning, not for themselves. This is not an ego trip that we have to warn you, don't do it. Don't go down that route. Don't turn the Torah into a way to service yourself, because that we've already been taught multiple times. Here he's telling us something fascinating. Do not learn Torah for the perspective of finding greatness in the Torah. What does that mean? Well, we'll unpack it. We'll come back to it. Okay, but the point is that he's telling us don't look for greatness in the Torah that you're learning. Okay, interesting point. Let's go further. Ve'al tachmoid kavod, and do not desire honor. Now let's analyze the different words over here. Al tevakesh gedula, do not seek greatness. Al tachmoid kavod, do not desire honor. What is the difference between the word seeking and the word desiring?
Well, I think if you seek honor, in fact, you actually, to learn Torah, that you should learn how to honor others and to be able to elevate yourself.
Okay, I'm asking a simple question.
Oh, sorry.
Just the language. What's the difference between the word seeking and the word desiring?
Maybe it's because she's actually going out and...
There you go. Seeking is something you do, and desiring is something you feel. Now we can have, and it's a very normal expectation, we can have control over what we do. It's much more difficult to have control over what we feel. So the first part of this Mishnah that says, Al tevakesh gedula, don't go out proactively seeking greatness. I know that that's something that I could learn how to do. I could learn, even if I have the desire, I could at least restrain myself not to act on the desire. That's relatively easy. The second one, Al tachmoid kavod, do not desire honor. That's a far greater challenge. Because now you're telling me that I shouldn't have a feeling which might actually be a natural feeling of mine. So that's quite insightful, and it's quite a development. We're scaling this up. First we're talking about what we shouldn't do, and then he's telling us what we shouldn't feel about what we'd like to do. Very interesting.
It's like...
Covet.
No, but especially the word covet.
Yeah, it has a negative connotation. The word tachmoid has a negative connotation, and yet, whether we like it or not, it's a sentiment, and it's not always so easy to control sentiment, which may be one of the most important messages from this Mishnah, that as Jewish people, it is not sufficient for us just to control our actions. We actually have to learn how to discipline our feelings. In fact, that's the greatness of a human over an animal, because an animal doesn't have the capacity to direct or mature or curtail inappropriate feelings. And being a human, that's a really big part of being a human. It's to be able to do that. That's why the word lo sachmoid is in fact one of the 10 commandments. Do not covet what somebody else has. That tells you that a very big part of being a human being, and specifically a Jewish person, is to learn how to redirect the emotions that we have. Very interesting. Then he says, okay, so those are two kind of restrictive clauses. Don't and don't. Don't seek the greatness and don't yearn for or desire the kavod. Then he tells us something proactively that we should do. What should we do? Yoiser milimudecha aseh. Do more than... Now it's difficult to translate this. Are we saying do more than you learn? Are we saying do more than you've already learnt about? What exactly is the message over here? Because the simplest way that most people, I think, would probably interpret this is, that you should do more things than learning. In other words, learning is great, but it's more important to be proactive and to be out there in the world and to be making a difference. As we're shortly going to discover, that is not the message of this particular Mishnah. So then the message is probably, Yoser mi limudecha aseh. Don't wait until you've learned everything, understood it, and only then apply it. But this is a kind of Na'aseh v'nishma message. Do the things, even when you haven't yet learned fully what they're all about and what they mean. And that would be a really practical message for us. You don't have to master everything intellectually before you actually take it on. But isn't it strange that we're almost mixing our metaphors over here? Because yes, that might well be the message, that you've got to do more than you are, so to speak, intellectually prepared for. Still, the word limud obviously is describing learning, and the word aseh is obviously describing doing, or is it? Is the word aseh specifically describing doing? Do we have evidence of any other meaning of that word aseh? So what does it mean? Aseh means to do. Do the work of making a friend, right? Aseh l'chorab, actually. It's to make yourself a teacher, right? But so it's do the work of appointing somebody to be your Rav. Do we know any other meaning of the word ayin, sin, hey, that root? That any other meaning of that word? No? Okay. So here's one. You could take, it's the same word, and just use a slightly different variation of how the verb is constructed, and that gives us the word me'asin al hatzedakah. That it is possible in the days when we had real Jewish leadership of our communities, meaning to say they had authority, not like nowadays where we live under a governmental authority and our Jewish leadership can only really advise us. But in the days when we had real Jewish authority, they could apply sanctions on somebody if they wouldn't give tzedakah, or if they wouldn't support their children, or if they didn't give the half shekel, the machzis hashekel. So the word for that is me'asin, that we apply pressure to somebody in order to behave the way that they should. And so the word aseh has this connotation not only of doing things, but doing things that are possibly a little uncomfortable. So therefore you could read this line as yoser mi limudecha aseh, that you should actually apply personal pressure to learn more than you naturally would be inclined to learn. So it doesn't only mean do more than you've already got to learn about, but it actually mean learn more than you feel comfortable learning. And we're going to talk about that as well, because there's a very interesting Gemara about exactly that point. And then he tells us, and don't desire what the kings have on their tables. So I guess in those days, before the days of reality TV and celebrity worship, so what was the one thing that people ever wished that they could be was royalty. Oh, if you could be the royalty, did you see what they had on their table? Gives the impression of extravagance. So don't desire the extravagance of royalty. That's basically what it sounds like the message is. But the Medrash Shmuel says it means something completely different. It means something altogether different from what we expect. And this note contextualizes the entire Mishnah. I'm not sure if you're aware of this from personal experience, but you've probably read about it in a book. There's something called the Yetzer Hara. And the Yetzer Hara is, we do such an injustice to ourselves with these English translations. So how do we translate the Yetzer Hara? The evil inclination. And to be perfectly honest, for the average person who is not very familiar with Torah language, evil inclination does not sound very relatable. So maybe another way to describe it is that the Yetzer Hara is our self-defeating thought processes. Self-defeating in the sense that it takes us away from our spiritual development. So what is one of our most common self-defeating thought processes, or what is one of the most common Yetzer Haras? This is really fascinating when you think about it. So what would you say is one of the most common Yetzer Haras that exists? I'm sure we can put together a whole laundry list. So what are common Yetzer Haras? What are common inappropriate thought processes, self-defeating Lashon Hara? I knew that was coming. Lashon Hara, for sure, one of the most common Yetzer Haras that exist. True. What else? Now that we've got that out the way.
can't do it.
There you go. I can't do it, right? So that's really self-defeating. No, it's not for me. I'm not capable. I'm not learned enough. I'm not from enough. I'm not this enough. Whatever. I can't do it. Yes. Procrastination. Okay. So what's the source? Let's talk about that for a second. What is the root of procrastination? I can't do it. It's the same thing, right? Because I don't believe I can do it, so therefore I'm going to defer doing it because it's too overwhelming to consider doing it. So it's really the same principle as I can't do it. One of the most common, you know that expression people use, now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it? So once you hear that this is one of the most common Yetzer Haras, you'll recognize, oh my, this is top of the pops. What is one of the most common Yetzer Haras? The Yetzer Hara of wanting to do another spiritual thing at the time I'm supposed to be doing a spiritual thing. Which basically means that if it is time to learn, we want to do chesed. If it's time to do chesed, we want to learn. If it's time to daven, that's when we feel that we have to go visit somebody who's not well. When it's time to visit somebody who's not well, we have to go to a shiur. You know, it's a fascinating thing. And this is the reason that this is such a common and successful Yetzer Hara is because it's very difficult to discern. How do you know? How do you know which area you're supposed to invest in? Because they're all holy. Kulam ahuvim, kulam berurim, kulam kedoshim. You know, it's all holy things. It's not like I'm weighing up if I should watch a movie or go to a shiur. No, I'm far holier than that. It's, should I go to learn Torah or should I go assist a person who's having a difficult time? So that's where the Yetzer Hara really gets us. Really gets us. And according to Major Shmuel, that's exactly what this Mishnah is really all about, is the distraction from learning Torah. This is Kinyan Torah. This is the chapter that speaks about acquiring Torah. And therefore, whatever we're learning in this chapter is probably in the context of learning Torah. When he says, don't desire the king's table, he's not concerned that there's some guy sitting in a yeshiva learning all day long, who suddenly says, you know what, I'm giving this all up because I want to join the royal family. It's not a likely scenario, besides anything else, and we'll talk about this in the next Mishnah as well. It's not really up to you. You can't choose to become the king, to become royalty. It's not how it works. So therefore he says, what it means is this: people look at royalty, and by extension, they look at wealthy people and say, wow, look at how many mitzvahs they can do. Look at how much chesed they could do. I wish I was like that. So that's like the lottery negotiation. You familiar with the lottery negotiation? Person buys a ticket explaining to Hashem all the institutions that they will support with the tzedakah that they will give from winning the lottery. Because of course Hashem has no other way to get money to those institutions except by letting you win the lottery. So that negotiation is exactly what he's describing over here. The person says, I wish I was in a position. I wish I could contribute. I wish I could be the great donor and help all these families and run a hospital. If I had money, right? Everybody's had this conversation at some point. If I had money, this is what would happen. So he says, Al tis'ave l'shulchanam shel melachim. You shouldn't be desiring that. If a person has access to study Torah, then yes, it's an amazing thing to do all of those mitzvahs and to do all of that chesed. But if Hashem has not put that kind of money your way, then it's not what you're supposed to be chasing. Not only that, shulchancha gadol mishulchanam. The truth is, what you can achieve through Torah learning is superior to what people can achieve even by doing acts of kindness. Now, that's not to, God forbid, undermine the value of tzedakah and goodness and kindness. Those are really, really important things. However, at the same time, Torah learning is also not just a really important thing, but something that creates a relationship between us and Hashem that cannot be created in any other fashion. The Maharal goes even one step further than that. And he says the reason he says a table and a crown is because sometimes we look at people and we think that because of the contribution that they're able to make, they have the spiritual edge that we don't have. So we're not just jealous of the fact that they are able to be kind. We're sometimes jealous of the fact that they are able to have whatever the spiritual value is of doing so much good for so many people. So therefore he says, don't worry, your table, that means to say the bracha you have in your life, is even superior to their table, and your crown that represents your spiritual development is even greater than their crown. So that's effectively where the direction of this particular Mishnah is going. Now let's go back with that precursor, that preamble. Let's go back and let's look at the various elements that we're describing. If a person, because I left this hanging, right? If a person is looking for gedula, that is not personal greatness. They're not learning Torah so that they should be given accolades or respected by the community or paid a good salary. They're learning Torah because they want to find the greatness of Torah. So the question was, where do you find the greatness of Torah? In which sphere of Torah do you find the greatness of Torah? It's a very interesting question. In which sphere of Torah do you find the greatness of Torah? It's an interesting question, right? So the answer is, if you are in a position that you could be what we call a moire hoira'ah, if you could be in a position that you could direct other people how they should not only learn, but much more importantly, how they should apply their learning. So that's what we call a moire hoira'ah. Somebody can tell us practically, this is the halacha in this particular situation. That is considered the greatest level of learning Torah. For example, when we discussed this last time, David HaMelech, King David, the bracha that he had was Hashem imoy, that Hashem was with him, and the interpretation was halacha kamoisoi, that when there was an halachic decision to be rendered, his view always aligned with what Hashem wanted, and therefore everybody around him resonated with his view. So that's the highest level of Torah learning, the gedula, the greatness of Torah, is to be in a position that we could be the ones rendering halachic decisions. We could be the ones who showing the community how they should behave, how they should decide, what level of kashrus to observe, or how to deal with the genetic engineering, or what you do about weighing up whatever ethical issues there might be around war, or deciding business ethics. That's where we'd like to be. Says this Mishnah, Al tevakesh gedula le'atzmacha. Yes, that is the ultimate level at which a person could learn Torah. At the level that they become the one that the entire community depends upon in order to give them halachic direction. But even though that is the greatest part of learning Torah, that should not be what we're looking for when we learn Torah. We should learn Torah for the sake of learning Torah, lishma. Because Hashem wants us and has instructed us to learn Torah, that's why we're learning Torah. And if He wants me to be that person who will be the moire hoira, who will be the person instructing everybody else and guiding everybody else exactly how to live as a Jewish person and giving them the halachic decisions, then Hashem will take me down that path. But I shouldn't seek that path. Incidentally, this is a theme right throughout the whole of Judaism. The theme is that the people who are chasing a particular position are usually not the people who should get that position. Whereas the people who are humble enough that they shy away from the position, that's dafka who should get the position. And that's effectively what he's saying over here. He's saying that if somebody is seeking greatness, that would be a misguided way to learn Torah, even though it's a tremendous level to reach. And if a person is learning Torah for the right reasons, then Hashem will guide us to where we need to get to. Then he says, over and above that, not only should my motivation for learning Torah not be because I want to be the moira hira'ah, I want to be the person who's teaching and rendering halachic decisions. Not only that, ve'al tachmoit kavoid. Not only that, but you shouldn't even desire that you'll get any kind of respect and honor for whatever Torah learning you're learning. In other words, whether it be halachic, or whether you're learning Gemara, or whether you're learning philosophy, or whether you're learning mysticism, the motivation should never be the kavod that you're going to get. So now we've got a problem. What's the problem? Problem is we are not pure neshamas. We are neshamas that live in a human experience. Pure neshamas are in Gan Eden. So once upon a time we were, and at some point we become again pure neshamas. But in this world, we are not pure neshamas. We've got to dig deep to find our neshama. And most of the time we're operating with a conscious self that is pretty self-interested. And In the language of Hasidus, we call this the Nefesh HaBahamis. We call it an animal soul. And the reason we call it an animal soul is because it behaves in a way that is self-serving, because that's how animals are impulsively, instinctively going to behave. They're going to worry about themselves. Right? Like the Hadi-Das they don't check to see if they've left a mess after they pick through your rubbish. So that's the whole challenge of being a person trying to live aligned with what Hashem wants is my neshama is pushing in that direction, and this nefesh habahamis, which often is my louder voice, is pulling in the opposite direction. So how do you get your nefesh habahamis, for example, to learn Torah? How? Or let's put it a little differently, and this might be a little closer to home. Why do we learn Torah? We know the ideal. The ideal is we're supposed to learn Torah because that's what Hashem said, and we do it lishma, for the sake of heaven, and all those wonderful things. The reality is that's very often not what gets us to learn Torah. In other words, some days we feel completely on that page. I'm here to serve Hashem, that's what I'm going to learn. Other days, you check, it's a little bit chilly outside, it's easier to have a nice cup of tea and stay home than to go to the shiur. And you know who's saying that it's easier to stay home and have the cup of tea? Not the neshama. Neshama doesn't care about those things. It's the nefesh habahamis. It's this animalistic, self-interested part of ourselves that says, listen, me, I need X, I need Y. Don't make my life uncomfortable. So now, if I can't learn Torah and seek some kind of honor for it, then what am I going to use to get my nefesh habahamis to the shiur? And if I can't learn Torah in order to find the gedula, the great aspect of Torah that will allow me the opportunity to be a teacher in the community, if I can't do that, how do I get my nefesh habahamis to the shiur? It's not so simple. In other words, how do I self-motivate if I don't see that there's anything in it for me? Again, if I was a pure neshama, I wouldn't have this problem. The neshama would just float along and come learn Torah 24/7. But we're not. So how do we encourage the side of ourselves that would much rather be fill in the blanks? You know, like they used to have the bumper stickers. I'd rather be playing golf. So I'd rather be whatever. I'd rather be having coffee. I'd rather be sleeping. I'd rather be having downtime because there's nobody home. So this is the perfect opportunity just, to have peace and quiet. How do we convince that part of ourselves to get involved and to learn Torah? Yoiser milimudecha asay. Asay, we said, was the word of coercion. Guess what? There is no easy way. Some of the time, of course, we'll get our nefesh habahamis through the door with a little bit of incentive. Like, for example, the kiddush after shul. It's an incentive. It's worked for all of the generations. It's still working today. The menu might have changed slightly, but it still works. So one better than that is we've actually got to tell the internal behemoth, the internal animal, how to behave. I don't care how much a person loves their dog. You don't negotiate with your dog. You tell the dog, this is now the time to go outside. We don't have a conversation about it. You got to go outside. So in the same way, we've got to tell the animalistic side, the self-interested part of ourselves, you've got to do what you've got to do. Yoiser milimudecha asay. Let's re-vowel that word. There's another alternative. Yoiser milimudcha asay. Now, it doesn't really sound like a major difference. Limudecha, limudcha. What's the difference? There's a huge difference because the word limudcha means more than what you have become habituated to. Mitlamed is how you practice something and you get habituated doing it. So limudcha, you got to do more than you are used to doing. And that brings us to this really interesting Gemara. The Gemara tells us, and I'm sure you've heard this before, that you cannot compare a person who studies their Torah portion, whichever section of Torah it is that they're learning, 100 times versus the person who has studied 101 times. Remember this? So what does the Gemara say is the difference? The Gemara says the difference is a person who has reviewed their study 100 times is considered loy avodoi, somebody who has not served Hashem. Whereas the person who has studied 101 times is considered Oivei Delokim, somebody who has served Hashem. Okay. I really did not see any discrimination in that statement. So, for all the people looking for equality in Judaism, here's a great place to start. Okay? So now you've got to ask yourself this. We live in the 21st century. Or as they like to call us, the ADD generation. Who ever reviews anything in today's world? I wasn't even going to say 100 times. Who reviews anything in today's world? We live in the world today where the only thing I believe that somebody may do more than once is watch the same movie. But when it comes to learning, we are the generation that says, heard that already. Because we believe that there's so much content out there and there's always something fresh and new and interesting that we get a little bit bored. Ho-hum. I used to have a person who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But if I mentioned something in a drosha at shul, and I had said it even 3 or 4 years earlier, he'd come over and tell me, you said this 3 or 4 years ago. And it was highly frustrating because, we have to be able to recycle a little bit. I don't know if you've noticed, the parasha comes around annually, and not everybody in the room was there last year. But even more importantly, even if everybody was in the room, in Judaism we value review. Exactly. And in those days they didn't have printed books. So if you want to consolidate information, you have to review and review and review and review until it is absolutely locked into your mind. Now, unfortunately for us, we have printed books. In other words, unfortunately from the perspective that means we don't really use our memory anywhere close to what people used to. I'll tell you an interesting story. A number of years ago, a fellow came out here to South Africa. I won't get into all the details, but he's a professor, or at the time he was a professor. I think it might have been at Columbia, actually, University. A professor of psychology. And one of his majors that he taught was memory techniques. And I got to meet him and spend some time while he was visiting over here. We had many interesting conversations, one of which he said, what invention created the greatest damage to human memory? It's a fascinating thought. A pen. The pen. The pen. Which invention created the greatest damage to human memory? How can you imagine if that was the pen? How much more so the printed word? How much more so the ability to record digitally everything? It's totally trashed our discipline around memory. Meaning, in very simple terms, we all remember a time where we knew all of our friends' phone numbers. And now we know nobody's phone numbers. Right? So, in those days, in the time that we're talking about in the Mishnah's time, where there was no printed word, the truth of the matter is there wasn't even much written word. Because even the process of recording information in writing it wasn't a ballpoint pen and a pad of paper. You had to go out and you had to find parchment or papyrus and you had to prepare it, and it wasn't available wholesale, so how much did you already have? And then you had your little quill and your ink or your reed or whatever it was that you were using. So there was very little written information. So it was normal that when a person studied something, they studied it 100 times. That was limudam. That was their normal way. That's how they were habituated. That was how every single child in school was taught. For us, it sounds insurmountable, and for them, it was 100% normal.
Like the times table.
Yeah. But 101 times means you now feel that you've completely mastered this. The thought of having to do it one more time was a radical move. So the Gemara goes on to explain that the difference between learning 100 times and 101 times, which is the difference between somebody who is serving Hashem versus somebody who has not served Hashem, that's a very, very harsh statement, that a person could have reviewed their study 100 times and they were not yet serving Hashem for obvious reasons, because 100 times they were servicing themselves. 100 times consolidates that information, so it's in my interest. Once I've consolidated the information, what I'm going to learn going further is now no longer about me, it must be for Hashem. So the Gemara there uses a mashal, a metaphor of what are called shuk shel chamorim. A shuk shel chamorim is an olden day car rental business. So people would rent a donkey, and the purpose of the donkey was to transport stuff from point A to point B. And the rates for the donkeys were that if you rented a donkey to go, whatever it was, I don't remember the exact distance, but let's just say it was like 10 mil, which is like 10 kilometers, then the rate was 1 coin or 10 coins. But if you went just another kilometer beyond the normal range, the price doubled. Why? Because that's the normal range. That's what the donkeys are used to. And the minute you're doing something that is outside of the normal range, the value is exponential. Yoser milimudecha asay means the minute we push ourselves to learn more than what we were ready to learn, used to learning, whether that's more information, more time, or another review of information we've already learned, the minute we push ourselves beyond what is expected, it's now an exponential value that we get. This is where the extra mile comes from. That's where the expression comes from, this Gemara, right? Going the extra mile comes from this Gemara. So that's what he's telling us over here. The only way to motivate our nefesh habahamis, our animalistic side, to actually get on board and to actually learn is through pushing it. Because when we push it, it has this exponential experience, and it's a completely different ego afterwards, which is really powerful.
It's almost like the third meal on the Shabbat, that we do that for Hashem, even if you're full.
Well, tell me a Jewish person who's not full.
Yes.
At Shabbos afternoon. So exactly. Okay, then he says, so limudecha is your learning. Limudcha is your habit. So then he says, what happens when a person learns Torah in that way? What happens to such a person? So that person is what the Gemara calls man malkei rabbanon. Who is the royalty of our community? The rabbis, the people who have mastered the Torah. So now you've got this situation where a person is learning, and they're learning in such an incredible way with so much dedication that you look at that person and you say, wow, that person is like a king. They're like royalty. So then he says, "Va'al tis'ave l'shulchanam shel melachim." You shouldn't desire the tables of the kings. What does that mean? You shouldn't desire the tables of the kings. Why not? This is now reinterpreted as the rabbis, the scholars. Surely, if there's anything that we should desire, it should be to be like them, to be like the scholars and the rabbis. Well, now we're talking about shulchanam, their tables. Sorry, just an anecdote I wanted to share with you, and I meant to share it earlier. The third Rebbe of Chabad, the Tzemach Tzedek, once had a chassid who came to complain to him. He says, Rebbe, I don't know what to do. I have no motivation to learn. So the Tzemach Tzedek said to him, I don't know what I should do. I have a motivation to learn. In other words, implying that when we push ourselves when it's not easy, it's more valuable than when we push ourselves because we want to. So that's the Yosim Milimudcha. Okay, so coming back to the tables of the kings, why the table? What do you expect to have on a table? Obviously, you expect food. We're Jewish people. We don't expect the first reference, the first connection we're going to have between a table is going to be food. Maybe other people would see a set of cards on the table. I don't know. But for us, it's food. And we also know that as Jewish people, we have a very complicated relationship with food. Very complicated. Like you just said about the Suda Shlishis, the third meal on Shabbos. On the one hand, we have all these laws around food. Not only in terms of that the food should be kosher, but we have so many laws of self-discipline around food. You have to wait after eating this before you can eat that. There's certain things you can't eat at this time of the year, certain things you can't eat at that time of the year. You've got to wait for the Omer before you can have the new crops. You can't have chometz on Pesach. On Sukkot, you can eat whatever you want, just not wherever you want. Think about it. We have many restrictions around food, and maybe the one that overrides them all, and yet for some reason doesn't get nearly enough attention, is the prohibition against gluttony. It's a very big thing. The Rambam relates it to the Ben Sora Umora, that's the rebellious child, and from that he derives that we're not allowed to overeat. The Rambam, as you know, was very strict about not eating even to the point of feeling full. And we, Knain Hora, eat to the point beyond feeling full. So we have this strained relationship with eating because on the one hand there's all these restrictions and on the other hand all these obligations. You have to enjoy Shabbos and you have to eat on Yom Tov, and then there's a bris, and that's a Sudas mitzvah, and then there's a wedding. And before you know it, we've got this tension in our experience. So one of the reasons there's so much tension is because eating becomes a metaphor for what life is like in this world. There's a lot of tension. Any time that a Jewish person engages with the physical world, there's a tremendous amount of tension. On the one hand, we are not a nation that encourages a hermit-like existence. And in order to fulfill what the Torah wants from us, we actually need physical things. You have to be able to afford kosher food. You have to be able to afford a beautiful esrog. You have to be able to afford Pesach. And on the other hand, we're not supposed to be materialistic, and we're supposed to learn Torah and not get completely invested in the business world. So we have this tension. The person who's the king in this particular story is somebody who's managing that tension really well. Because what they're doing is they're royalty in the sense that they're engaged in Torah, and they're royalty in the sense that they're engaged in the world. They have both a table and a crown, as the Maharal said. They have both physical and spiritual greatness. Because they are completely invested in the world, only ever extracting the spiritual value in materialism. They are never invested in the world just for the pleasure of the world.
It's almost easier just to be a hermit.
It's much easier to be a hermit.
Yeah,
Much easier.
to balance the two.
Much easier to be a hermit. That's why we don't do it. Because Judaism doesn't take the path of least resistance. So,
Is there any connection to the shulchan and the Beit Mikdash?
I think so. Definitely. I mean, that's a broader topic than the specific Mishnah. But there's a general relationship between eating on a table and the table in the Beis Hamikdash, and also the Mizbeach. There's a lot of connection between our table and the Mizbeach as well. So that tension is about engaging the material world in order to get the spiritual value out of it. So food should become a conduit to serving Hashem. Money should become an opportunity to do mitzvahs, and so on and so forth. Because we have that tension, a person might be tempted to dafka want to engage more in the material world, because look how much value there is. We can get all of these things to be connected to Hashem. We can translate money into mitzvahs. We can translate food into a spiritual service of Hashem, like the service in the Beis Hamikdash, etc., etc. So that's why he tells us, there's no question about it. That's what we have to do. That's where Hashem wants us. Hashem wants us to engage the world, and he wants us to make a difference. We've got to get it right in our head that al tisaveh, that our personal desire should not be the materialism, because there's a huge difference. I once had a guy tell me in a shiur, we were learning about this topic, and he said one day, he was a university student at the time, he said, one day I am going to own a Ferrari. I said, where did you learn that in the shiur? How did that come up? We were learning about this principle of, drawing out the spiritual and holy potential inside material things. He said, well, if I have a Ferrari and I drive it to a shiur, that would be a mitzvah. I'd be utilizing the Ferrari to get to the shiur. So that's exactly what we're talking about over here. Al tisaveh. Hashem wants us to engage in the material world so that we can involve it in our spiritual development, but it shouldn't be our desire to actually want those material things and then, kind of just peg onto it, and I'll also serve Hashem. That's how we keep our balance. And then he adds, when you learn Torah, a shulchan is a place you eat. Eating represents the things that become part of us because we digest it. When you learn Torah, the holy experience is not just something you do to the world, it actually becomes part of you. The holiness of Torah becomes part of you. Whereas when you're only engaged in transforming the world into something holy, while you're making a massive impact, it doesn't become part of your reality. Torah becomes part of our reality. And we know that from our own experience, because when you learn Torah, it becomes how you think. It becomes your guide. It becomes your perspective on the world. Not only that, but even the keser, even the crown, the difference between a crown and food is that food is something which gets absorbed into the system and becomes part of my lifeblood, whereas a crown is something that sits outside of the system. I put it on top of me. And yes, even though that has a huge impact on who I am, and people will treat me differently, and my status in society will fundamentally change, the fact is it's not part of me. And so throughout Jewish spiritual teachings in Hasidus, in Kabbalah, we always see the crown as representing experiences of holiness that are far greater than anything we could ever digest. So when you're out there in the world and you're making the world into a holy place by engaging materialism the way that you should, that brings a tremendous amount of energy to the world. It's a crown of the world. It's way, way beyond what the world could handle or understand or appreciate. The world doesn't feel the difference. And even so, when you learn Torah, kisrecha, the spiritual radiance, the divine presence, when you learn Torah, even at that level, what we call makif, the level that is completely beyond what we can understand. There's a part of Torah that we understand. Then there's the infinite part of Torah that we'll never understand. It's this week's parasha. Right? In this week's parasha. You should follow my chukim, the mitzvahs that are not rational. Rashi says, what does it mean? Shetiyu amelim b'Torah. That you should toil in learning Torah. What does amelim b'Torah mean? To push yourself more than you feel ready to learn. 101 times. When we do that, when we step outside of our system, when we dedicate ourselves to learning Torah beyond our natural expectations, or what we believe to be our natural abilities, then we get the keser of Torah. We get the part of Torah that is beyond the human mind. And that is far greater than the godliness we bring into the world. Even though it's very powerful by engaging materialism, the godliness we bring into the world by engaging in Torah study is far superior to that. And that's ultimately his message. Kinyan Torah, there is nothing that is more impactful on ourselves, and even by extension on the world around us, than learning Torah.